This last week, the last 10 days or so, were a really momentous event in the history of the independent Christian church. That's what Westwood is a part of. Indeed, it was a momentous occasion for the American church in general. You see, August 6th through 12th marked the 225th anniversary of the Cane Ridge Revival. The Cane Ridge Revival took place in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. It is the site of the largest revival on American soil in one kind of series of meetings. Over those 6 days, it was 1801, so the reports are not super clear, but we know that there were at least 10,000 people, and as many as 30,000 people possible attended the Cane Ridge Revival. You can still go to the Cane Ridge Meeting House, by the way. It's kind of funny, though, because it's a wooden building built in 1800, and it didn't take long before they realized this building was going to rot out from under us. And so what Kentucky did was they built a giant concrete box around this historic landmark. So it's nothing to look at from a ways, but you can still go to this meeting house. In fact, at Cane Ridge over the last week, they held a series of sermons and worship services in this meeting house in honor of the Cane Ridge Revival. The Cane Ridge Revival is important for us because one of the founders of our movement, by the name Barton W. Stone, was a preacher at that revival. And at that revival, one of the interesting things about it is that it wasn't held by only one denomination of Christian. It was an ecumenical service before anybody even knew that word existed. At the Cane Ridge Revival, there were Baptist preachers and Methodist preachers and Presbyterian preachers, and Barton W. Stone was raised an Episcopalian. There were all these different church denominations present. And Barton W. Stone, in his autobiography, described how he saw the Spirit moving in the lives of all these people who were there. And Barton W. Stone came away saying, wait a minute. If the Spirit can move as a response of Baptist preaching and Presbyterian preaching and Methodist preaching and Episcopalian preaching, if the Spirit can move as a response to all of these different sermon types, Christian types, denomination types, then the Spirit must not have a favorite denomination. If the Spirit can move from all these different people, then the gospel must not be unique to any one of them. The power of our salvation in the gospel of Jesus, the differences between these denominations must not be gospel differences. And that realization is a realization of epic proportion. That may feel like an obvious thing to us today, but that's because 225 years ago, a revival happened on the frontier of the Americas that changed how church was understood. Indeed, all non-denominational churches today have the outpouring of Cane Ridge to thank for their existence. It was a monumental 6 days in rural Kentucky, not too far from Lexington. Barton W. Stone would say, in response to this revelation, he would say, let Christian unity be our North Star. May the thing that we orient our lives around be Christian unity. That is what Barton W. Stone said. It's one of the reasons that I, in my leadership as a pastor, I talk so much about ways that we can get involved with other churches in our city and in our community. It's why we do things like Love Dane, which you can sign up for in the lobby. It's one of the reasons that we do things like the Ecumenical Thanksgiving service in November. It's one of the reasons that we do things like Kingdom Justice Summit, where we come together with Christians from all over Dane County. We ask, how does justice come into our community? It's one of the reasons that we do some of the things that we do. Let Christian unity be our North Star, declared Barton W. Stone. But our gospel reading today seems to be the opposite of unity, doesn't it? In our gospel reading today, we have this harsh word by Jesus. Jesus calls a Canaanite woman a dog. Where's the unity, Jesus? What do we do with this passage? It certainly appears to be showing favoritism, not unity. A Canaanite woman approaches Jesus and his disciples and asks him to heal her daughter because her daughter has a demon. This feels like the kind of thing Jesus should want to do, doesn't it? Jesus says, I don't feed the children's food to the dogs. And what's remarkable is that instead of taking offense to that, if I said that to you, you would say, now hold up a moment, sir. There would be a write-up on my annual report. Adam called someone a dog. We got to talk about this. But instead of taking offense to what Jesus says, she owns it and plays along, doesn't she? Even dogs get to eat crumbs that children drop. Anyone who's had both kids and a dog knows that's true. And then Jesus praises her faith and heals her daughter. There is a prevalent idea in this passage, in interpreting this passage, that Jesus changed his mind. In fact, there's actually there's an interpretation that has come out in the last decade or so that says this is one of the places where Jesus' humanity is on full display, and his own racial prejudice comes out, and then she changes his mind. That is an actual interpretation you can find of this text. It is one I don't hold, but we have to understand that it is out there. I think it's better to look at how Jesus says something that is true and how he might be playing into things that he himself doesn't actually hold. And here's what I mean. It is true. Scripture is very clear that Jesus was sent to the Jewish people. He is the Jewish Messiah who appeared in response to the Jewish scriptures, sent by the Jewish God to the Jewish people who were oppressed by the Roman Empire. Paul, in Romans, we've been reading Romans this summer. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and then also for the Greek or the Gentile. I'm not Greek, but I am a Gentile. And that might feel weird to us. It feels weird for God to show favoritism. Jews first, why? Well, again, I just told you it was their scriptures which said Jesus was coming. It was to their people that Jesus came. Jesus was the son of David. Jesus came through the promise that was given to the Jewish people in accordance with the Jewish scriptures, promised by the Jewish God. They were the ones who were supposed to see him coming. But Paul was clear. He says, for everyone who believes, it is saving power. And then in verse 17, the next verse, he says, for in the righteousness of God, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. You see, Paul says that Jesus may have come first to Jews and then to the Greeks, but the way that one is saved is by faith. And what he's saying there, we cannot miss this. What he's saying there is that no one is saved because of their racial or ethnic background. You are not saved just because you were born to a certain kind of person, or in a certain household, or in a certain community, or in a certain country, or in any other way you might want to define yourself. The saving power, the gospel, is given through faith. faith the remarkable thing of this Canaanite woman, according to Jesus. Matthew has not been shy up to this point that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for all people. In fact, in chapter 1, the chapter of Matthew that most of us skip, it's the genealogy. Okay, I know you skip it, it's okay, but you should read it. In the genealogy, there are 4 Gentiles mentioned by name: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Uriah. Actually, Uriah is not mentioned by name. He's alluded to. Regardless, he's a Hittite. He's a Gentile. 2 of those, Tamar and Rahab, are in fact Canaanite women. So the Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus in Matthew 14 was prefigured, was foreshadowed in these 2 women who get to be part of the genealogy of the Son of God. After the genealogy, the part that many of us start reading, the birth of Jesus, we read about Magi, wise men from the east, Gentiles who come and worship Jesus as a baby. In Matthew chapter 8, there's a centurion, a Roman soldier, who comes to Jesus and says, "My slave is sick. Please come heal him." In fact, there's all sorts of comparisons between the centurion in Matthew 8 and the Canaanite woman in Matthew 14. If you read their stories next to each other, Jesus interacts with both of them in very similar ways. He's hesitant at first to go for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the Jews are already frustrated with him. If he breaks purity law, what then might happen? And will he lose some of his followers before the cross? In fact, the centurion's slave and this Canaanite woman's daughter, they're the only 2 synoptic healings that happen at a distance, both Gentile. Jesus, with the centurion, is willing to go to the centurion's house, and he says, "Look, man, I'm a soldier. I know how authority works. You say the word, and my son will be healed. My slave will be healed." And Jesus is like, "Wow, I have not seen such faith anywhere in Israel." See, Matthew's not shy about Gentiles and the great faith of some of these people. And so we need to be careful about reading into this passage the favoritism and the hatred or the prejudice of Gentiles in the person of Jesus, because I don't think it's there. We have to read Jesus' response to this woman in light of what comes before and what comes after. And I'll remind you that the book of Matthew ends with a commission to go make disciples of everybody, Jew and Gentile alike. Jesus and his disciples have left the region of Galilee, presumably to retreat from the public eye. They've been in a back and forth with some Pharisees, and Jesus is like, "Look, I'm tired. I just want to hang with my bros." And so they go to the region of Phoenicia, to the region of Tyre and Sidon, 2 very Greek cities, well-known Greek pagan cities. But this is not the first time these 2 cities have shown up in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 21, Jesus is criticizing the people that he's done deeds of power among. He says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Jesus effectively tells the Jewish people, look, there are Gentiles who, if I did this in their city, they would have repented yesterday. He's actually holding up them as being willing to repent, being willing to follow Jesus. We might ask, if that's true, why didn't you go there, Jesus? Why didn't you do your miracles there? If people would have repented long ago, why didn't you go there first? And the answer is because he was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. He's a Jewish man, born to Jewish parents, circumcised on the 8th day, raised according to the Torah. He came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The Gentile world would hear the gospel, but he was sent first to the Jewish people. And yet, this Gentile Canaanite woman has faith that astounds Jesus. The people here are ripe for the harvest. And here's a woman whose faith astounds Jesus. There's a humility on display in this woman that is rare even among people Jesus interacts with in the Jewish world. Jesus calls her a dog, playing on the Jewish favoritism of his day, and also reinforcing his disciples' own opinion of this woman who is following them around and nagging them. To play with the image here, I remember my mom would often yell at Sadie, our dog, "Go lay down. We're eating. Stop following me around." If you have a dog, you've probably had to deal with Thanksgiving where you're bringing food from the kitchen to the dining room, and there's a dog the whole way, like, the first thing that drops off that plate is mine. True story, one year, we ate Thanksgiving dinner at home and then went out somewhere. No, sorry, it was Christmas. It was Christmas Eve. We had Christmas Eve dinner at home, had turkey, went to Christmas Eve service at church, came home, turkey carcass all over the kitchen floor. We hadn't put it away. Sadie got up and ate it all. No leftovers for us. So Jesus is kind of playing with this idea of this person who's following along and nagging. Won't take no for an answer. That's how the disciples feel. And this woman, though, she does not deny her dogness. She doesn't say, "I'm not a dog, how dare you?" She says, "Yes, I'm a dog, Lord. I am a Canaanite. I'm not a Jew. I'm not the one to whom you were sent. I am Phoenician." She sees herself accurately. Unworthy to eat the crumbs of the Son of God's table. "I'm not worthy, Lord, to sit at your table. Can I have a crumb? Can I have a crumb? Can I have the part of the food that you're not even going to eat? I don't need to eat. I'll just gnaw at the bones. I'll eat what they don't want." And because of this word of both faith in the power and love of Jesus, as well as the humility of her spirit, Jesus says, "Let it be so as you desire." Wow. There's a church father whose name is Epiphanius, the Latin. Man, they had great names back then, right? Can you imagine that conversation between Epiphanius' mom and dad? Like, what if we name him Epiphanius? Like, yeah, great, I love it. Anyway, Epiphanius calls this woman the mother of all Gentiles because he sees in her a request not only for her own daughter, but a desire for all Gentiles to abandon their idol worship, their demon possession, and to kneel at Jesus' feet and cry aloud to the Lord, the Son of David. In refusing to accept the Jewish exclusion of Gentiles from the blessing of God, this woman stands as a prophetic foreshadowing that the unity of God has no place for favoritism based on anything but faith. In our Sunday school class, as we have followed the story of Abraham through Joseph, which we read the last Joseph passage of today, In this story, we have pointed out over and over and over again how favoritism is part of the problem with this family. Over and over again, this family would not have the problems that it did if it would just not be show favoritism. Isaac versus Ishmael, Jacob versus Esau, Joseph versus 10 of his brothers. Many of the problems of this family, of the patriarchal family of Israel, have to do with favoritism. And this issue, which was there from the beginning of the Jewish story, is there at the time of Jesus. The idea that one person or group is favored above another is dangerous. It breeds contempt between the groups or people. We see that in the Joseph and Jacob and Isaac stories. Favoritism is what bred all the contempt of that family. And it's not the way of the gospel. It's not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus stands in defiance of the capricious, malicious ways of the culture and world around us. Favoritism still happens today, right? We know that. We've all said the thing, well, I'm just not their favorite. For us today, the world's desire to divide, to show favoritism and preference, can be countered by a community of faith that desires unity and compassion and partnership amongst its people. I do not mean that it is good for anyone to feel ostracized or discriminated against. What I hope you hear me say is that in a world where those things are the norm, a community that makes its norm the opposite stands as a light to the world. We stand as a city on a hill. We stand showing the radically different community of Christ. To declare to the world that the only thing we require of you to be a part of our community is a humble recognition that without Jesus, we are all lost. The thing that unites us is our need for Jesus. The thing that connects us is a humble recognition of our brokenness. Not just your brokenness, but my brokenness. This is why our statement of faith, the confession that we ask you to make before you are baptized or before you become a member here, is short, and it's focused on the desperate need for Jesus. Because the thing that binds us together in unity is our need for a Savior. It's not our age, our gender, our education level, our political party, our skin color, or any other delineating factor that you may think of. The thing that we all are bound in is the humble recognition that we need Jesus. And that allows us to dwell in unity that refreshes like dew on a mountain on a hot day. It is my hope that we will be a community that embodies this radical countercultural community, that does not draw lines as the world does. In fact, when we see a line, I hope you'll cross it. That you'll bridge the gap between you and someone else, that you'll reach out, that you'll make friends with people who you do not know, that you will engage people who come to this building, who come to this community, who come to our events, that you will seek to build relationship with them, that you will seek to not allow anyone who comes in contact with Westwood to feel like a Canaanite castaway. There are no Canaanite castaways allowed here. But that requires us to be a community that builds the connection across what might otherwise divide us in the humble recognition that all of us need Jesus. It is faith, Paul says, that unites us in salvation, and faith alone. I want to close, I always close with prayer in my sermons. Today, I have a prayer that we're going to say together. I want you to say this prayer with me. It's a prayer that is used in a number of even more liturgical churches than us. It's called the prayer of humble access. In fact, the Anglican Church, Christ Church, that uses our building occasionally, this is part of their weekly liturgy book. It's called the Prayer of Humble Access, and I think that it's a good tie-in to the idea of one's worthiness to eat the scraps or crumbs that fall from a table. It reminds us that we are not worthy, and yet Jesus has offered salvation to us through faith. Would you say this prayer with me? We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness. But in thy manifold and great mercies, we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under your table. But thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. Grant us, therefore, gracious Lord, so to eat the flesh of thy dear Son, Jesus Christ, and to drink his blood, that we may evermore dwell in him and he in us. Amen.